Case 1. Mateo Lange. In the pre-dawn dark of November 6, 2020, a neighbor in an Oroville, California apartment complex was jolted awake by 2 gunshots. He stepped outside, and what he saw made no sense. A young woman was walking calmly out of the apartment next door, pushing a baby stroller. Inside it, a 22-month-old child. She handed the neighbor the stroller and a note, the little boy's name, and a number for his grandmother. Then she turned and walked back inside. As the neighbor dialed 911, a third gunshot rang out from within the apartment, captured live on the call. Inside, 22-year-old Mateo Lange lay dead on a mattress on the living room floor. 22 years old. A young father barely at the beginning of his own life, with a little boy just learning to walk and talk. The day before, a camera in that very apartment had recorded him doing the most ordinary, tender thing, playing with his son on the floor. He had a whole life still ahead of him, birthdays he would never see, a child he would never watch grow up. And it was ended by the one person who was supposed to stand beside him through all of it, his wife. Now that wife, Jessica Rose Nichols, sat calmly on the front steps beside a 9mm pistol, waiting for the police. When detectives questioned her, Nichols had an explanation ready. Self-defense. She said Mateo had been abusive, that he had charged at her, threatened her, and she'd had no choice. It was a serious claim, and investigators tested it against the evidence, every piece of it. What they found dismantled her story completely. Mateo had not been charging at anyone. He had been lying flat on the floor, under a blanket, his head on a pillow, a bullet hole through the blanket, fragments in the pillow. He was asleep. He never saw it coming. And then came the detail that made it undeniable. The apartment had a security camera, and it had a microphone. It had recorded the entire thing. There was no argument before the shots, none. The audio caught the first gunshot, then the sound of the pistol jamming, then Nichols calmly clearing the jam, chambering a fresh round, and firing again. That is not the sound of panic, it is the sound of resolve. And the same camera, from the night before, had caught something else. Mateo, telling Jessica he was going to leave her the next day and end the marriage. Her own phone finished the picture, messages showing that in their home, she had been the aggressor. The self-defense claim collapsed under the weight of her own recordings. In August 2025, Jessica Nichols pleaded no contest to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years to life, plus 10 more for the gun, 35 years to life in all. Mateo Lange's case leaves us with something worth carrying. Real domestic abuse is devastating, and real victims deserve to be believed. That must never be lost. But a claim of self-defense is not a shield that forgives everything behind it. It has to meet the evidence. And here, the evidence had been recording all along. There is a harder truth beneath this one too. Mateo died the night before he planned to leave. That threshold, the decision to walk away, is again and again the most dangerous moment in a failing relationship. He was only 22, a young man who should have had decades in front of him, who should have taught that little boy to ride a bike and walked him to school, gone, at the hands of the person he had once chosen to love. What remains is a son who will grow up on the memory of a father playing with him on the floor, captured by the very camera that told the truth about how he died. Case 2. Jason Harper. Jason Harper was 39 years old, and by every account, he was the kind of man a community is lucky to have. He taught math at the local high school in Carlsbad, California, and coached volleyball, the sort of teacher students remember for the rest of their lives. He was a devoted father to 3 young children and a husband who, for 10 years, had built a family with the woman he married. He was, quite simply, a good man in the middle of a good life. He had decades ahead of him, his kids to raise, teams to coach, a classroom that would have shaped hundreds more students. All of it ended on the morning of August 7, 2012, in the bedroom of his own home. That morning, the couple's 3 children, the oldest just 8, the youngest barely 1, were downstairs watching cartoons. Upstairs, Jason was shot once, from behind, the bullet entering the back left side of his torso and passing through his heart. His wife, Julie Harper, was the only other adult in the house, and there has never been any question about who pulled the trigger. What Julie did next would matter as much as the shooting itself. She did not call 911. Instead, she covered Jason's body with blankets and clothing, gathered up the children, and drove away to her father's home. It would be a day and a half, roughly 30 hours, before she was taken into custody. When she was, Julie told a story of self-defense. She said Jason, a former athlete who stood 6'7", had come at her in a rage, threatening to kill her, and that she feared he would rape her, as she alleged he had before. She said the gun went off almost by accident as he charged at her. It was a claim the jury would weigh seriously, because a woman's fear for her life is never something a court can take lightly. But the evidence around that claim told a very different story. The single most damning fact was the wound itself. Jason had been shot from behind, not the mark of a man charging forward at his killer. Police found no injuries on Julie to support a violent struggle. The murder weapon was gone. She said she had buried it to preserve it, but despite extensive searches, it has never been recovered. And in her father's garage, investigators found a packed bag, jewelry, credit cards, passports for Julie and the 2 older children, and a handgun. In the days before the shooting, she had gathered some $20,000 in cash, forging Jason's signature to pull thousands from their accounts and emptying thousands more from her own daughter's college fund. To test her claim that the gun had fired by accident, prosecutors had the jurors dry fire an identical Derringer. Its trigger required 10 to 11 pounds of deliberate pull. It could not have gone off by mistake. Julie Harper was tried twice. Her first jury acquitted her of first-degree murder but could not agree on the lesser charge. At her retrial in 2015, a second jury convicted her of second-degree murder. In early 2016, she was sentenced to 40 years to life. At sentencing, the judge spoke a truth that cut through everything. Her husband, he said, had received the real death sentence, and he was never coming back. Jason Harper's case asks us to hold 2 things at once. A genuine fear of abuse is real, and it deserves to be heard, always. But fear and evidence still have to meet, and here, a body left covered, a vanished weapon, a forged withdrawal, and a packed bag spoke louder than the story. What lingers is the cost measured in the smallest voices. 3 children who lost their father in their own home, one of whom told the court she would never call her mother Mom again. Jason should have grown old watching them grow up. Instead, a good man's life was cut short a few feet from where his children sat watching cartoons, never knowing that the morning had already taken everything from them. Case 3. Robert Harris. On a January night in 2013, sheriff's deputies were called to a home in Placerville, California, in the hills east of Sacramento. Inside the bedroom, they found 73-year-old Robert Harris, Bob, to everyone who knew him, dead in his bed, a shotgun nearby. His wife Colleen was there, though police weren't called until more than a day after he died. And as investigators began to piece together what had happened, they uncovered something that stopped them cold. Nearly 30 years earlier, in that very same house, Colleen's previous husband had also died of a shotgun blast. Bob Harris was, by every account, a pillar of his community. He spent 30 years as a respected federal land manager, retiring as the supervisor of the Lake Tahoe Basin for the U.S. Forest Service, a central figure in protecting one of the most beloved landscapes in the country. He was a volunteer trainer for the county sheriff's office and a legendary local baseball umpire who called thousands of games, from Little League to the semi-pro leagues. His own son would remember him as witty, driven, and generous, a genuine contributor to the world around him. Bob's life was not without fault. He traveled often to teach conservation abroad, and on those trips he had begun an affair with a younger woman, a betrayal he was, by accounts, ashamed of. He and Colleen had a complicated history, divorced years earlier, yet still living together as husband and wife. When Colleen discovered the affair in the fall of 2012, what was left of the marriage began to come apart. Bob was preparing to leave her for good. For a time, wary of how she might react, he kept his distance, but he always came back to that house. Months passed, and Colleen stewed. Then, on that January night, as Bob lay sleeping in their bed, she walked into the room with a 12-gauge shotgun and killed him. When it came time to explain, Colleen offered a story of confusion. She said the two had struggled over a gun, that she had blacked out, and that when she came to, Bob was dead. A gray fog, she called it, with no memory of pulling the trigger. It was an echo of another defense from another death, because in 1985, in that same Placerville home, Colleen's second husband, James Batten, had been shot and killed, and she had stood trial for it. Then, too, she claimed a limited amnesia. Then, too, she claimed self-defense. And that time, a jury acquitted her. This time, the evidence would not allow it. Bob had been shot as he slept, not the chaos of a struggle, but the stillness of an ambush. And her gray fog story collapsed under the weight of her own actions. She claimed she had blacked out and never left the house, but her own phone records traced a drive all the way to the Bay Area in the hours after Bob died, where she quietly dropped his phone and other belongings at her son's home. Her attorney, who spoke with her before police were ever called, described her as clear, articulate, and certain of exactly where she was and what she needed. That is not the behavior of a woman lost in a fog. It is the behavior of someone managing an aftermath. Prosecutors argued the most damning point of all, that the months she had spent stewing over the affair were not a loss of control, but time to decide. This was not an accident. It was a plan. And the jury was allowed to hear about that earlier death from 1985, not to retry it, but to show that what happened to Bob was no tragic mishap. After a 5-week trial, the jury deliberated less than 2 hours before finding Colleen Harris guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, who called the evidence overwhelming and the act one of the most selfish he had seen in a lifetime of law, sentenced her to 50 years to life. An appeals court later upheld the conviction. Colleen Harris died behind bars in July of 2022, at the age of 80. Bob Harris's case leaves us with a hard truth about the stories we tell to explain a death. Amnesia, a struggle, a fog, these can sound like tragedy. But forensic evidence does not forget, and it does not blur. A sleeping victim, a plan months in the making, and a pattern that stretched back decades, told the truth that no story could cover. Bob deserved to grow old among the people and the places he had spent his life protecting, remembered not for how he was taken, but for the thousands of small ways he gave. Case 4. Ghulam Ayobi. Ghulam Ayobi had already survived more than most people ever will. A veteran of the Afghan army, he had come to build a life in the United States, working as a cultural trainer for the U.S. Army, teaching American soldiers to understand the country he came from. He was 53 years old and a father of 4. His work took him back and forth between a base in Louisiana and his family's home in Sacramento, where his wife, Shajia, kept the household. He had crossed war zones and oceans to give his children a safer life. The danger he never saw was inside his own family. Late on the night of December 17, 2011, Ghulam and Shajia were driving home from a dinner party with friends, an evening that looked to everyone who saw them perfectly ordinary. As their minivan traveled along Interstate 80, Ghulam sat in the front passenger seat. And there, on the freeway, he was shot in the head. Shajia pulled over and called 911, screaming that they had been ambushed. The story she told was dramatic and specific. Two young strangers, she said, had secretly hidden in the back of their van, emerged with guns as they hit the freeway, demanded money, shot her husband when he resisted, and then fled into a waiting car on the shoulder. It was a tale of random, terrible violence, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. But almost immediately, it didn't add up. Detectives found it nearly impossible that two armed adults could have hidden, unnoticed, in the back of the couple's van. A random carjacker had no reason to execute the passive front seat passenger while leaving the driver unharmed and in control of the car. And Shajia's account kept shifting, the scripted-sounding dialogue she quoted, and then, under questioning, an entirely new claim that the CIA had orchestrated her husband's death because of his military work. The stories multiplied. The evidence did not support any of them. The truth came from two places her cover story never anticipated. The first was a classmate. Shajia had been studying criminal justice at a local college, and there she had met a young man named Jake Clark. She had asked him, under a false story about a friend being abused, whether he knew anyone who could make a person disappear, and eventually offered him thousands of dollars to make it happen. The second was a dumpster. Near the murder scene, investigators recovered a discarded black bag. Inside was the gun used to kill Ghulam and Ghulam's own wallet and identification. On that bag was DNA, and it belonged to Jake Clark. The staged carjacking collapsed entirely. This had not been a random crime on a dark freeway. It had been arranged, planned, paid for, and set into motion by the victim's own wife. On the stand, faced with the evidence, Shajia finally admitted she had contracted a man to kill her husband, though she insisted she had acted out of fear. But the jury weighed a defense of sudden terror against a timeline of deliberate steps: recruiting, negotiating, paying, and coordinating the disposal of the weapon afterward, and found the two could not be reconciled. On May 1, 2013, Shajia Ayobi was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 26 years to life. Jake Clark was convicted separately for his role in the killing and sentenced to 28 years to life. To this day, exactly whose finger was on the trigger that night has never been established. The two had planned it so completely together that, in the eyes of the law, it no longer mattered. They were equally responsible. Ghulam Ayobi's case is a different kind of tragedy from a crime of sudden rage, and its lesson is its own. A killing arranged from a distance, through a hired hand, dressed up as a random act of violence, is built on the belief that distance means safety, that if the orchestrator's own hand never touches the weapon, the truth can't reach them. But planning leaves a trail as surely as a struggle does. A recruited stranger, a paid arrangement, a bag in a dumpster, each was a thread, and each led back to the same place, the person closest to him. Ghulam survived a war and crossed the world to build a safer life for his children. In the end, the danger he never saw coming was not a stranger on the road, but a plot within his own marriage. He deserved the safety he came here to find, and the evidence gave him the only thing it still could, the truth of who was responsible. And this case leaves a second warning, one the others do not. Because Shajia Ayobi did not act alone, she found someone willing to help. Jake Clark was, by most measures, an ordinary young man with his whole life ahead of him. He had no quarrel with Ghulam Ayobi. He had never even met him. He agreed to take part in the death of a total stranger because a classmate spun him a story and offered him money. And for that, he will spend decades of his own life in prison. His choice is a lesson in itself. When someone draws you into their plan, their reasons become your responsibility. A story you never verified, a favor you never questioned, a scheme that seemed like it belonged to someone else. None of that shelters you when it ends in harm. The law did not treat Clark as a bystander who got used. It treated him as what he was, a man who said yes. Whatever someone tells you to justify what they want done, The wise and the safe response is the same. Know exactly what you are agreeing to and who it will cost before you ever agree at all. 4 California marriages, 4 husbands, and 4 times a carefully told story that could not survive contact with the evidence. Mateo Lange, 22 years old, told the truth about how he died by the very camera meant to watch over his home. Jason Harper, a teacher and coach, betrayed by a wound that entered from behind. Bob Harris, undone not by a bruise or a blast, but by his killer's own calm drive across the state in the hours after. And Ghulam Ayobi, who survived a war only to be lost to a plot that traced straight back to his own marriage. If you take one thing from this episode, let it be this, because it may, one day, matter more than you expect. In case after case, the false story arrives wearing the same few disguises. The accident, the gun just went off. The self-defense claim, I feared for my life. The blackout, I don't remember what happened. And the outside threat, a stranger did this, it wasn't me. Each of these can be true. Real accidents happen, real victims defend themselves. And that is exactly why these stories are chosen, because they borrow the shape of something we instinctively believe. But here is what these 4 cases teach, together, that no single one could. A true account and a fabricated one behave differently under pressure. The truth tends to stay still, the details hold, whoever asks, however many times. A constructed story tends to move, it grows new characters, it shifts its own timeline, it reaches for a bigger and bigger explanation the moment the small one is questioned. A carjacking becomes a government conspiracy, a struggle becomes a fog. And a fabricated story almost always contradicts the one witness that cannot be coached, cannot be frightened, and does not take a side, the physical evidence. The blood, the wound's direction, the recording, the trail of a phone across a map. These do not perform grief, and they do not change their answer under a second question. That is the quiet lesson beneath all 4. When a story and the evidence disagree, it is almost never the evidence that is lying. None of this is about learning to distrust the people we love. It is the opposite. The victims in these stories were not naive. They were trusting, in the way that decent people are. The lesson is not to become suspicious of everyone. It is to know that when something does not add up, when the account keeps changing, when the facts on the ground refuse to match the words, those instincts are worth listening to. Attention is not betrayal. Sometimes, it is the only protection there is. These 4 men were not their final moments. They were a young father on the floor with his son, a teacher who shaped 1,000 students, a man who spent his life protecting the wild places he loved, a soldier who crossed the world for his children. They cannot benefit now from being seen clearly. The rest of us still can. And so we close by honoring the ones who carried these cases to the truth. The families who waited through years of trials and told their loved ones stories when they no longer could. The detectives who refused the easy answer. The forensic teams and analysts who let the evidence speak. The prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the judges and jurors who held the whole weight of it with care. Because justice is never one moment, it is many people choosing to do the work right. If you are in a relationship that frightens you, especially if you are trying to leave, because leaving is so often the most dangerous moment, please reach out. Help is confidential, and it is there. You will find the number on your screen and in the description below. To the families still carrying these losses, may you find peace and truth and room to heal. Thank you for thinking alongside us, and thank you for remembering the names we said.